33% of college professors have faced housing insecurity. One night, a security guard found a woman who embodied that statistic, not on a campus, but asleep on his library floor, using a stack of academic journals as a pillow. She was a former professor who had lost everything. What happened next wasn't an eviction. It was an investigation that would lead to an offer she never saw coming. The guard called the building's owner, a reclusive philanthropist named Elias Vance. Instead of calling the police, Vance saw something in her meager belongings, a faded faculty ID from a prestigious university. This was Dr. Elena Reed, a once rising star in comparative literature. Her fall from a tenured position to a library floor poses a brutal question: how does a respected academic become invisible? And what Vance discovered next would challenge every assumption about charity and redemption. Elias Vance arrived before dawn. He found Elena Reed curled in the philosophy section, her worldly possessions fitting into a single canvas tote, that expired faculty card, 3 annotated novels, and a final eviction notice dated 2 months prior. She wasn't sleeping rough by choice. She was a casualty of a broken system hiding in plain sight. Vance knew the statistics, that 38% of college instructors struggle to afford food and housing, but confronting a living, breathing scholar on the floor of his own library made the data feel like a moral failure. He quietly ordered the guard to make coffee and left a warm blanket beside her, choosing not to wake her. Then he retreated to his office and began to investigate the name on the battered ID. Dr. Elena Reed had been, by all academic metrics, a success. A doctorate from Stanford, a celebrated first book on 19th-century Gothic literature, and a tenure-track position at the prestigious Linden College by age 32. Her student evaluations glowed with phrases like life-changing and the reason I became an English major. But the institutional reality behind that facade was crumbling. The higher education economy had shifted beneath her feet. In the decade following her hire, Linden, like thousands of colleges nationwide, began replacing secure tenure lines with contingent adjunct positions. These roles paid an average of $3,500 per course, with no benefits, no job security, and no office. By 2018, Elena was what the industry calls an adjunctive, teaching a full course load across 3 different institutions, commuting over 200 miles a week, yet legally classified as a part-time contractor. Her annual income barely cleared $28,000. Then the dominoes fell. A chronic autoimmune condition, manageable with medication, flared. Without employer health insurance, her medical debt ballooned to $47,000. Her aging car, essential for her commute, needed a $4,000 transmission repair. She missed 1 rent payment, then a second. Her landlord, a large corporate entity, initiated eviction proceedings with zero flexibility. Within 18 months, the professor who had lectured in wood-paneled halls was surfing couches, then living in her dying car, and finally, when the car was towed, seeking refuge in the only institution that remained open and free, the public library. Vance pieced this together through public records, academic forums, and a discreet call to a contact at Linden's administration. The chair of the English department, when pressed, admitted they had no idea where Elena was. "We assumed she moved for another position," the chair said, the bureaucratic indifference in her tone chilling Vance to the bone. The system had consumed her talent and then erased her without a trace. But here's what the records didn't show: the human cost. Vance discovered Elena's last published paper, submitted just before her disappearance. It was a brilliant, scathing critique of Victorian narratives about the deserving poor. The irony was almost too painful to bear. She was writing about societal blindness while becoming invisible herself. This wasn't a story about bad life choices. It was a story about a trap, meticulously engineered by policy and institutional greed. Driven by a deep, unsettling identification, Vance's own fortune was built on a disruptive tech startup that had, he now uncomfortably realized, contributed to the housing crisis squeezing people like Elena. He made a decision. He wouldn't just write a check. He would attempt something more radical, something that addressed the root of her invisibility. He waited for her to wake. When Elena finally stirred, wrapped in the blanket he'd left, she was met not with security, but with a breakfast tray and a note. "Dr. Reed, my name is Elias Vance. I own this building. When you're ready, I'd be honored to speak with you in my office. No pressure, no hurry." The kindness, so unexpected after months of institutional coldness, broke her. She wept silently between the stacks for 20 minutes before gathering the courage to ascend to the ornate, book-lined office on the library's top floor. Their first conversation lasted 4 hours. Elena, her academic dignity still intact despite her circumstances, spoke not with self-pity, but with the analytical precision of her training. She mapped her own collapse like a case study, citing studies on adjunctification, the soaring cost of prescription drugs, and the algorithmic cruelty of modern property management. Vance listened, captivated. He wasn't meeting a homeless person. He was meeting a first-class mind that had been systematically discarded. At the end of their talk, Vance leaned forward. "The easy thing," he said, "would be to give you the money for an apartment and a fresh start, but that would just return you to the same volatile edge. The hard thing, the thing I think you actually need, is to be seen again, not as a victim, but as the expert you are." He then unveiled his proposal. He wanted her to lead a first-of-its-kind research project, fully funded by his foundation, housed right here in the library. The subject, documenting the crisis of homelessness among highly educated professionals in America. She would have a salary, healthcare, and an apartment, but more importantly, she would have a purpose that weaponized her painful expertise. Elena sat in stunned silence, the offer hanging in the air like a foreign object. It was everything she needed, yet it felt like a paradox. To study the very abyss she had just climbed out of. Before she could answer, Vance's assistant hurried in, her face pale. She whispered urgently in his ear. Vance's expression hardened. He turned back to Elena, the moment shattered. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice tight. "It seems the library board has gotten wind of our situation. They're emergency convening a meeting right now, and they are demanding I evict you immediately." The board's emergency meeting wasn't about protocol, it was about perception. The chairman, a real estate magnate named Lawrence Croft, viewed Elena's presence not as a human crisis, but as a liability. "This isn't a shelter, Elias," Croft's voice crackled through Vance's speakerphone. "Her kind attracts more of her kind. We have donors to consider." The phrase, "her kind," hung in the office like a foul smell. Vance looked at Elena, who had shrunk into her chair, the fleeting hope from his offer draining from her face. In that moment, he saw not a professor, but a woman bracing for yet another rejection from a powerful institution. Vance ended the call with a terse promise to address the board in person. He turned to Elena. "Wait here," he said, his voice firm. "Use the private bathroom, rest. This isn't about you, this is about a fight that was already coming." He left her in the sanctuary of his office and descended to the library's basement meeting room, where the 5-member board had convened via a glitchy video conference. Their arguments were a masterclass in coded language, safety concerns, setting a precedent. Mission drift. Croft, his face a pixelated mask of disdain, cited a single incident years prior where a person experiencing homelessness had allegedly been disruptive. He was weaponizing anecdote against humanity. But Vance had come prepared. He didn't plead, he presented. He relayed Elena's credentials, her published work, the systemic forces that led her here. He quoted the National Alliance to End Homelessness, finding that 53% of people in shelters are employed. "She isn't a vagrant," Vance stated, his voice cutting through the static. "She is a displaced knowledge worker, and this library of all places should understand the value of that." The board was unmoved. They voted 4-1 to demand Elena's immediate removal, threatening to freeze the library's discretionary fund endowment, a quarter of its operating budget, if Vance refused. Defeated in the committee room, Vance returned upstairs to find Elena standing by the window, her tote bag slung over her shoulder, ready to leave. "I don't want to cause trouble," she said quietly, her gaze fixed on the city below. "I've taken enough of your time." But Vance was no longer just a philanthropist facing board resistance. He was a man who had seen the gears of the trap up close. "Sit down, doctor," he said. "The trouble has just started, and I need your expertise." He opened his laptop and showed her what his research team had dug up while he was in the meeting. It wasn't just about her. Cross-referencing public housing waitlist data with professional licensing databases, they had identified over 40 individuals in their county alone with master's degrees or higher who had experienced homelessness in the past 18 months. There was a former civil engineer now sleeping in his van, a licensed veterinarian assistant couch surfing, a community college biology instructor living in a tent city by the river. Elena's case wasn't an anomaly, it was the leading edge of a silent wave. This was the pivot. The story shifted from one woman's tragedy to a systemic epidemic hiding behind society's preconceptions. Elena, her analytical mind snapping back into focus, pored over the data. "The bridge between employment and homelessness isn't unemployment," she murmured, tracing lines on the screen. "It's the gap between wages and rent. It's the absence of a single financial shock absorber." She was no longer a subject of the research. She was its lead investigator, her personal experience the key to interpreting the cold numbers. Vance made a decisive, risky move. He instructed his foundation's lawyer to draw up an ironclad independent contractor agreement for Elena, effective immediately, appointing her the principal investigator for the Atlas Project, a study on educated homelessness. The contract came with a signing bonus substantial enough for a deposit and first month's rent on a modest apartment. He wasn't giving charity, he was issuing a professional grant. This was the something she never expected, not a handout, but her vocation returned to her with purpose. Elena signed, her hand trembling only slightly. The apartment was secured within 48 hours, a small studio with bright windows, but the victory was fragile. Lawrence Croft and the board learned of the contract and were furious. They saw it as a blatant end run around their authority. They launched a whisper campaign among major donors, suggesting Vance was mismanaging library resources and prioritizing social experiments over literacy. The library's public funding stream, tied to a municipal partnership, was now under threat. The battle lines were drawn: institutional preservation versus moral intervention. Meanwhile, Elena began her work. Her first step was intimate and brutal. She recorded her own testimony. Sitting in her new, quiet apartment, she spoke into a recorder, detailing the visceral humiliation of grading freshman essays by flashlight in her car, the calculus of choosing between insulin and gas money, the eerie feeling of becoming a ghost to your former colleagues. This testimony became the core of the project's first report. But to give it weight, she needed to find others. Leveraging alumni networks and discreet contacts at professional associations, Elena and a small team began to reach out. The responses were hesitant, shrouded in shame. Many were still employed, terrified that their housing instability would cost them the jobs they desperately clung to. One subject, a high school teacher we'll call David, agreed to meet only at night in a deserted park. "I have a master's degree and 15 years of experience," he told Elena, his voice hollow. "My students think I live in a nice house. I live in a storage unit. If the school finds out, they'll say I'm unstable, a risk. My career ends." Elena's project was uncovering a powerful, hidden truth. For the educated poor, homelessness isn't just a lack of shelter, it's a double life, a performance of stability maintained at immense psychological cost. The data she compiled was staggering. In their state, a teacher's average salary would require them to spend 52% of their income to afford a one-bedroom apartment at fair market rent. For an adjunct professor, it was over 80%. The safety net had vanished. Vance, fighting the board firestorm, used these preliminary findings as his ammunition. He took the data to a sympathetic city council member who was horrified. A small emergency pilot program was proposed, a housing voucher initiative specifically for municipal and state employees, including educators who were on the brink of homelessness. It was a direct policy outcome born from Elena's work. But this public victory was the match that ignited the board's full opposition. Lawrence Croft scheduled a public hearing for the library's budget renewal, a normally mundane event. He packed the room with allies and donors. When Vance stood to present the library's annual report, Croft interrupted. He took the floor and presented a dossier not on library metrics, but on Vance. He accused him of using public infrastructure, the library, to run a private advocacy group, of creating an unsafe environment, and of financial impropriety by directing foundation funds to a personal project with a formerly homeless individual of questionable reliability. He then gestured to the back of the room. A man stood up. He was polished, stern, and introduced himself as an attorney representing several concerned donors. He presented a formal petition for Vance's removal as chairman of the library board, citing breach of fiduciary duty. The room erupted. Vance was blindsided. This was no longer a policy dispute. This was a corporate takeover attempt aimed squarely at him. As security struggled to maintain order, Vance's eyes found Elena, who had come to observe the hearing. She looked pale, shaken, the weight of this vicious counterattack crashing down on her. The project, her new home, her fragile redemption, it was all now tied to Vance's impending downfall. And the man leading the charge, Lawrence Croft, was about to reveal he had a personal stake in seeing Vance ruined, a secret buried in a real estate deal that had gone sour years ago. Lawrence Croft's vendetta wasn't about library policy, it was about revenge. A decade prior, Vance's tech startup had indirectly scuttled Croft's flagship real estate development by acquiring a key parcel of land Croft needed. Croft lost millions. He'd been waiting for a chance to return the favor, and a vulnerable, homeless professor was the perfect weapon. The public hearing chaos was just his opening move. In the days that followed, the attack went nuclear. Croft used his media connections to plant a sensational story in the city's business journal. The headline read, "Philanthropist or fraud, library chairman uses charity to house former lover." The article twisted every fact. It painted Elena not as a scholar, but as a mysterious woman with a troubled past who Vance was harboring. It mentioned her eviction, but omitted her doctorate. It quoted anonymous library staff expressing fear. The subtext was clear and destructive. This was a scandal, not a humanitarian project. The fallout was immediate. 3 major donors publicly withdrew their support. The municipal partnership was put under review. Vance's foundation was flooded with angry emails, but the most damaging blow was personal. Elena, finally beginning to feel safe in her new apartment, saw the article shared on a local news site. The comments section was a sewer of speculation and cruelty. She felt the walls of her hard-won stability vibrating with the same hostile energy that had forced her onto the streets. She called Vance, her voice a thin wire of panic. "I should disappear. I'm destroying everything you've built." Vance, fighting a 5-alarm public relations fire, made a critical choice. He didn't ask her to lie low, he asked her to step into the light. "They want a story about secrets and scandal," he told her. "We will give them a story about truth and consequence, but we need proof, not just data, faces." He proposed a drastic, risky escalation. They would fast-track the Atlas Project's first public report and hold a press conference, not in a boardroom, but in the main reading room of the library. Elena would present her findings, alongside 2 of the other hidden homeless professionals they had identified, if they were brave enough to come forward. The race was on. While Vance's legal team fought the petition for his removal, Elena and her small team worked around the clock. They anonymized the data, but humanized the statistics with searing, anonymized testimonials. The teacher living in the storage unit, whom we called David, agreed to participate via recorded audio interview, his voice digitally altered. A former nurse, now living in her car between shifts, provided a written statement. The report was a thunderbolt. It laid bare the direct line between state divestment from higher education, the gigification of professional work, soaring housing costs, and human ruin. But Croft wasn't finished. He obtained a copy of the report draft through a sympathizer on the library staff. His lawyer used it to file for a temporary restraining order against Vance and Elena, alleging the project was causing irreparable harm to the library's reputation and function and was an unauthorized use of library resources. A court date was set for 1 week later. The legal system was now being weaponized to silence them. Here's where the story took its darkest turn. As Vance's investigators dug deeper into Croft's past dealings to prepare a defense, they uncovered something that reframed the entire conflict. Croft wasn't just a disgruntled businessman. He was the silent majority owner of Stable Home Properties, the very corporate landlord that had filed the eviction against Elena Reed 12 months earlier. He had profited directly from her homelessness. His opposition wasn't just personal revenge. It was a strategic move to suppress a study that exposed the practices of his own lucrative business empire. When Vance presented this information to Elena, the air left the room. The man trying to destroy them was the same man whose policies had nearly destroyed her. The systemic evil she was studying had a name, a face, and was sitting on the library board. This revelation changed everything. It transformed their struggle from a philosophical debate about charity into a stark, personal battle against a predatory system. Armed with this knowledge, Vance made a final, all-in play. He bypassed the local media and went straight to a nationally respected investigative journalist at a major newspaper, laying out the entire story: the professor, the research, the retaliatory landlord, and the attempted cover-up. The journalist, intrigued by the stark collision of academia, homelessness, and corporate power, agreed to dig in. But journalism takes time. They had days until the court hearing, where a judge could shut down the Atlas project and potentially reinforce Elena's eviction. Pressure mounted from all sides. Elena, operating on sheer adrenaline and moral fury, finalized the report. The two other participants, inspired by her courage, made a breathtaking decision. They agreed to appear at the press conference, not in shadow, but in plain sight, wearing simple disguises to protect their current employment. They would be living proof. The night before the press conference, Vance received a private, last-ditch offer from Croft, delivered by a neutral intermediary. The terms were simple. Vance resigns quietly from the library board, the Atlas project is dissolved, and Elena is given a sizable relocation grant to leave the state. In return, all legal actions disappear, and Croft uses his influence to restore the library's funding. It was a clean, cold buyout. Vance presented the offer to Elena, leaving the choice in her hands. She could have safety, money, and an escape from the war her life had become. Elena spent a long night in her apartment, surrounded by the data points of broken lives. She thought of her students, of David the teacher, of the nurse in her car. She thought of the library floor that had been her bed. Accepting the offer would mean confirming every powerful person's assumption that people like her had a price and could be made to disappear. She declined. The morning of the press conference arrived. The library's great reading room was packed with reporters, curious patrons, and a cluster of Croft's supporters who had come to heckle. The atmosphere was tense, volatile. Vance stood at the podium, looking out at the divided crowd. He didn't speak about legal threats or board politics. He spoke about the purpose of a library. This institution, he said, exists to give voice to stories that would otherwise be silenced. Today, we are here to listen to one of those stories, not from me, but from the expert we almost failed to see. He then introduced Dr. Elena Reed. Elena walked to the podium, a stack of reports in her hands. For a moment, she looked exactly like what she was, a terrified woman. Then she looked at Vance, then at the two other professionals standing quietly at the side of the room, and she began to speak. She didn't talk about herself. She talked about the systems. She presented the data on adjunct wages, on medical debt, on algorithmic evictions. She played the audio clip of David. She held up the written testimony from the nurse. And then, for the first time, she publicly connected the dots. She revealed that the corporate landlord responsible for her own eviction was a company owned by the library board member leading the charge to shut this research down. The room erupted in gasps and shouted questions. At that precise moment, Lawrence Croft entered the room. He hadn't expected her to have the proof. He hadn't expected the others to show up. He stood at the back, his face a stone mask, watching his narrative crumble. As reporters swarmed, shouting questions about stable home properties, he turned and left without a word. The story was now bigger than a local dispute. It was a national emblem of corruption and resistance. The press conference was a watershed. The investigative journalist's story broke online 2 hours later, backed by documentary evidence of Croft's ties. Public sentiment shifted violently in Vance and Elena's favor. The city council member publicly demanded Croft's resignation from all civic boards. The court, sensing the changed winds, delayed the restraining order hearing indefinitely. But in the euphoria of that victory, a single chilling email arrived in Vance's inbox. It was from the chairman of the University Board of Trustees at Linden College, Elena's former employer. The subject line read, "Concerning the conduct of Dr. Elena Reed." The board had reviewed the media coverage and was initiating a formal ethics inquiry into whether Elena had brought the profession into disrepute through her public activism and undignified circumstances. The institution that had abandoned her was now threatening to formally strip her of her academic standing. The battle for her home was over. The The battle for her very identity was about to begin. Linden College's ethics inquiry was the ultimate betrayal. The institution that had cast Elena aside now sought to retroactively blame her for its own neglect. But the board had miscalculated. They were operating in an old world where academia's secrets stayed hidden. The new world, the one Elena and Vance had just fought for, was watching. The inquiry letter demanded Elena respond to charges of conduct unbecoming a scholar and bringing the university into disrepute through her public homelessness and subsequent media spectacle. The implicit threat was the revocation of her doctoral degree, the final erasure of her professional identity. Elena read the letter in Vance's office, her hands steady but her eyes blazing with a cold fire. "This is the final boss," she said quietly, "the system defending itself." Vance urged an aggressive legal defense, but Elena chose a different weapon, radical transparency. With his support, she published the full inquiry letter along with her point-by-point response on the Atlas Project's website. Her response was not a legal brief, it was a scholarly manifesto. She juxtaposed Linden's own adjunct pay scales against the area's median rent. She included her own student evaluations, her publication record, and then the timeline of her collapse, annotated with Linden's own policy decisions to replace tenure lines with contingent labor. The title was a simple question: who brings whom into disrepute? The academic world, already simmering with adjunct activism, erupted. The story went viral within professional circles. Petitions supporting Elena sprung up, signed by thousands of professors and graduate students from around the globe. Major academic associations released statements condemning Linden's action as punitive and antithetical to academic freedom. The media, now deeply invested in the narrative, framed it as the professor versus the ivory tower. Facing a PR disaster far worse than anything Vance had endured, Linden's board backpedaled with stunning speed. Within 72 hours, they announced the inquiry was being re-evaluated in light of new context. A week later, it was quietly dropped. The president of the university, in a private letter to Elena, offered a vague apology for the distress caused and an invitation to serve on a future committee examining faculty welfare. Elena filed the letter away, a trophy of a battle she never wanted to fight but was grateful to have won. With the academic threat neutralized, the dominoes began to fall in their favor. The public outcry over Croft's dual role as library board member and predatory landlord forced his resignation from all city committees. The investigative piece sparked a state attorney general's inquiry into the practices of stable home properties. Croft, now a toxic figure, retreated from public view, his empire under scrutiny. The library board, reconstituted without Croft and his allies, voted unanimously to reinstate Vance as chairman and to formally adopt the Atlas Project as a special library initiative, securing its funding and place within the institution. The war for the library was over. The Atlas Project, now operating with legitimacy and resources, exploded in scope. Elena's initial report became a book, a bestseller in policy circles. She was invited to testify before a state Senate subcommittee on housing. Her data was instrumental in passing the Educator Housing Stability Act, a pilot program providing emergency rental assistance and down payment support for public school teachers and community college faculty in the state. The teacher who lived in a storage unit, David, used the new program to secure an apartment. He sent Elena a photo of his new keys on a ring with a small, engraved apple. The nurse in her car found stable housing through a new nonprofit partnership the project helped forge. For Elena, the transformation was profound. She was no longer Dr. Reed, the homeless adjunct. She was Dr. Reed, the leading expert on economic precarity in the professional class. She accepted a prestigious fellowship at a progressive think tank, a role that came with a salary that finally matched her expertise. She bought a small, comfortable house not far from the library. But she kept her apartment, the one Vance had secured for her, turning it into a dedicated office and safe haven for the Atlas Project's interview subjects. The circle was complete. The space that represented her rescue was now a tool for rescuing others. Vance, for his part, underwent a quieter revolution. The battle had cost him socially, severing ties with old money donors who sided with Croft. but it had gained him something more valuable, a clear purpose. He redirected a significant portion of his foundation's portfolio away from traditional hands-off philanthropy and toward what he called justice capital, investments in affordable housing co-ops, legal aid for eviction defense, and seed funding for worker-owned cooperatives in the service sector. He and Alina developed a fierce, platonic partnership, a meeting of minds where the library became their laboratory for social repair. The story seemed to have reached its natural, hopeful conclusion, but a year after the press conference, a final, surprising detail emerged, one that cemented the profound irony of their journey. While digitizing old library donation records, an archivist uncovered a ledger from 1952. It listed the original benefactor who funded the library's philosophy wing, the very section where Alina had been found sleeping. The benefactor was named Alistair Reid, a wealthy industrialist with a passion for the humanities. He was Alina's great-grandfather. The room that had offered her final refuge as a person with no home was, in a literal sense, built with her family's money, a legacy she had never known about, lost through generations of distance and discord. The library had not just saved her, in a way, it had called her home. This revelation struck Alina not as a claim to wealth, but as a profound metaphor. It spoke to the interconnectedness of past and present, of how societal structures we build can, generations later, either trap us or catch us when we fall. She included the discovery in the epilogue of her book, writing, "We are all sleeping in rooms built by our ancestors. The question is whether we will wake up and repair the cracks in the foundation for those who come next." On a practical level, the discovery changed nothing about her life. She did not seek inheritance or make claims, but it deepened her commitment. She and Vance established a permanent endowment within the library, named the Reid Vance Catalyst Fund, dedicated to supporting research and direct aid for professionals in crisis. The fund's first initiative was a national helpline and resource network for adjunct professors, staffed by peers who had experienced housing insecurity. The final scene of this chapter took place back in the library's main reading room, now a place of triumph rather than tension. Alina was giving a guest lecture to a class of sociology students. She stood at a podium, confident, pointing to graphs projected on a screen. In the back of the room, leaning against a bookshelf, Elias Vance watched, a faint smile on his face. The security guard who had first found her, now promoted to head of community safety, gave Vance a knowing nod. The system had not been overthrown, but a crack had been opened in it, and through that crack, light was pouring in, illuminating a path for others. The central promise of that initial shocking hook, the fallen professor offered something unexpected, had been fulfilled in a way that dwarfed simple charity. She was offered not just a hand, but a microphone, not just shelter, but a platform, not pity, but partnership. And in reclaiming her own voice, she gave voice to a hidden multitude, proving that sometimes the most powerful act of redemption is to turn your survival into a strategy. The story of Alina Reid forces us to ask an uncomfortable question. In a society that venerates education, how have we built an economy where educators can wind up sleeping on the floor? Her journey from the shadows of the stacks to the spotlight of policy change is more than a tale of personal rescue. It is a mirror held up to our collective priorities, revealing the fragile line between stability and despair that millions of educated workers walk every single day. We often mistake homelessness for a problem of laziness or addiction, a narrative of personal failure. Alina's case and the data from the Atlas Project shatters that myth. It reveals homelessness as a structural fault line where the tectonic plates of stagnant wages, soaring housing costs, and evaporating benefits collide. The people falling through are not strangers. They are the teachers who inspired us, the nurses who cared for us, the professors who shaped our minds. Their invisibility is a choice our systems have made. Elias Vance's intervention worked not because he was wealthy, but because he was willing to see a person instead of a problem. He offered partnership, not pity. That shift in perspective, from charity to collaboration, is the real revolution her story proposes. It asks what might happen if we stopped trying to fix the homeless and started empowering the experts hidden within their ranks. The library, in the end, served its highest purpose. It was not just a repository of books, but a sanctuary for a human story that needed to be told. It became a laboratory where a brutal social ill was diagnosed not by distant analysts, but by a living subject who became the lead researcher. This is the ultimate takeaway. Solutions to our deepest crises likely already exist within the minds of those most affected. Our job is to listen. Elena's legacy is measured in more than policies passed. It is measured in the teacher who now has an apartment, the adjunct who called the helpline, the collective realization that dignity is not a privilege reserved for the successful, but a right inherent in every human being. Her redemption was not a return to her old life, but the creation of a new one, forged in the fire of experience and dedicated to ensuring others would not have to endure the same fall. So the next time you walk past a public library, or sit in a lecture hall, or read a study about economic insecurity, remember this story. Remember that the line between the podium and the pavement is thinner than we dare admit. And remember that the most powerful acts of change often begin with a simple, radical act of seeing someone not for what they have lost, but for what they still have to give. If this story reshaped your understanding of homelessness, share it with someone who needs to see this perspective. For more documentaries that explore the human spirit facing impossible odds, subscribe and join our community. Thank you for watching.